Welcome to Haftarah Ki Tisa. We're in 1 Kings 18, verses 1 through 39. So this is the story, that dramatic story of Elijah confronting the prophets of Baal and Asherah, right? So there's this competition of sorts happening. We've got two altars with sacrifices, one for Baal, one for the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the winner will be the God who actually burns up the sacrifice. So the question is, who will it be, right? Now, this was one of my favorite things to teach my children back in the day. Back then, I knew that the best way to help my children to learn something, and it was also a great way for me to sort of gauge their understanding of the material, was for them to take what they just learned and then teach it to somebody else, right? Now, side note, that's a good practice for you and I too. The best way for us to retain new information is for us to turn around and teach it to somebody else. So you can tell it verbally or you can tell it in writing, but retelling something helps you to solidify your learning, and it also helps you to know whether or not you really understand a subject, because you have to understand it well enough to teach it, right? So anyway, back to the kids and homeschooling. So I would have the children reenact something that I had just taught them in homeschool. So Elijah's brave contest in 1 Kings, that was a family favorite. We'd have this dramatic setting up of the altar stones that Elijah did, pouring water on the altar, to make it more difficult for our God to get the sacrifice lit, right? So 3 times the water would come pouring, be dumped out. The children loved to dance around, yelling and screaming and doing the things to kind of mimic the prophets of Baal, right? And then they'd always fight over who got to be Elijah, because it kind of sounds like Elijah's taunting those prophets a little bit. And so the kids, some of the kids would want to be the one to do the taunting, right? That was also another favorite part. Now, I don't know if the children understood the magnitude of what was at stake in that scene that they reenacted, right? Because they were young. But here's kind of the background of what's going on, right? So at this time, the kingdom of David is split into the northern and the southern tribes. And we've talked about this before, right? So the southern tribes have Jerusalem and they have the temple. The northern tribes were led originally by Jeroboam, and he set up those 2 altars as substitutes for the temple. And we were introduced to Jeroboam back in, I think it was one of the Haftarahs in Genesis. And we learned that Jeroboam didn't have sacred objects for his 2 altars. So he just came up, substituted new ones, right? The golden calves in each of those locations. And we know that the northern tribes pretty much worshipped with these calves for the duration of the kingdom of Israel. So at the time of this particular Haftarah, we've got another king, and that's Ahab. And we've heard about him before too. Now, before we get to this Haftarah, we have a little bit of background on Ahab. In 1 Kings 16:33, it tells us that Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel than all the kings of Israel who were before him. And then another thing about King Ahab. So kings at this time, when they wanted to secure a military alliance with a neighboring kingdom, they would often marry like the daughter of that king. And so that's what Ahab did. He married the princess of Tyre. That was Jezebel. Now, there's a lot of things that could be said about Jezebel, and one of the things was that she was very zealous for her god, Baal, who was the god of Tyre. This was also the god of, supposedly, of fertility, rain, and storms. Now, Jezebel made the worship of Baal kind of like the state religion. And at the same time, she tried to eradicate the prophets of the God of Israel to get them out of the way. So, at this time, most of the people in the kingdom, the northern kingdom, they had accepted this state religion alongside their belief in the God of Israel. So Elijah, he's God's prophet that was raised up at this time. And Eliyahu challenges the rain god Baal, and he declares a drought over the land of Israel, which lasted for 3 years. So if you ever wondered why a drought, was that a random thing? No, that was a direct confrontation against Baal, supposedly the rain god. So in our Haftarah, we have the scene where Elijah, who's the representative of the God of Israel, confronts Baal, the god of the state religion. Elijah tells Ahab to summon all the prophets of Baal who were on the government payroll, right? And to go up to Mount Carmel with all the people. So one of the gods will break the drought and the famine. But the question is, which one? Well, before we get into that, let's look at the tie-in with the Torah portion and this Haftarah. So in the Torah portion this week, we've got Moses, dealing with the sin of the golden calf, the sin of idolatry. And so, yes, in the Haftarah, we've got Eliyahu dealing with idolatry as well, right? The people were worshiping both the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and also Baal in the Haftarah. Now, what's interesting about these two accounts and the fact that they're the reason for the tie-in with this is why the Haftarah was chosen for this particular Torah portion. It's not because we have really two same accounts being told here. They're actually the inverse of one another. So the Torah portion begins with the people wholeheartedly worshiping God and then reverting to Egyptian worship through the golden calf, right? But in this Haftarah, we've pretty much got the people starting out worshiping Baal, but in the end, they revert, at least for a time, not revert. I need to think of a more positive word. They go back to the original, right, of worshiping the God of Israel. And they say it with this phrase, the Lord is the God. The Lord is the God. That's what they say at the end of the showdown on Mount Carmel between Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh and Baal, after it was clearly demonstrated that the Lord is supreme over Baal. So they say, they yell out, the Lord is the God. And that's the phrase that's actually recited at the end of Yom Kippur. And it's said that Yom Kippur was established after the sin of the golden calf. Okay, so there's that other tie-in with the Torah portion. But before the people declare the Lord is the God, Eliyahu has like a very important question to ask the people. And I think this is a question that's not only relevant to them, but it's also relevant to you and I today. So in the verses that are before this Haftarah, in chapter 17, verse 1, it says, Now Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the settlers of Gilead, said to Ahab, As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, surely there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. Okay? So remember that Baal is supposed to be the fertility god who provides rain, which is very important in this agricultural society. So what Eliyahu is saying here is that as God's spokesperson, he's claiming that it's actually the God of Israel, who's in charge of things and providing them with what's needed for their crops. And that this God alone can make it stop raining. So Eliyahu is saying that the drought and the famine is because of God. It's a direct result of God's action. And that Baal is actually helpless to do anything about it. Okay? So think about that. Baal is helpless to do anything about what God has set up. This is quite the statement. And it's a direct assault on the assumptions of the Canaanite religion. Okay? So this 3-year drought and now the showdown between Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh and Baal, it forces the people to come to terms with something that they've not really understood before, something that they've been really, really confused about before. So in the Haftarah, verses 21 and 22, it says, Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." But the people said nothing. Okay? So Eliyahu confronts Ahab. He's inviting Baal to demonstrate his power with a burnt offering sacrifice. And he's saying that only the true God will be able to burn the sacrifice. And that the one who does should be recognized as the one true God. Now, I like how Dr. Skip Moen, Torah teacher and biblical scholar, I like what he says in about 1 Kings 17 and 18. So I'm going to read from his commentary that I got online. So he says, the final scene of these 2 chapters is about the return of rain to Israel. It's one thing for God to demonstrate his supremacy over Baal in a public contest. It's quite another for his prophet to be able to stop rain and start it again through prayer. When Elijah prays for rain, Elijah proves that God controls all the heavens and the earth. There's no room whatsoever for a pagan god. The prophets of Baal are not protected, nor are they legitimate spokesmen for God. The religious hierarchy of the Canaanite religion is crushed. And then he goes on to say, the Canaanite religion is as modern as yesterday's news. Most of the world still operates with an assumption of the magical powers of the gods. And those of us who belong to the enlightened world of science have placed just as much trust in reason as ancient man placed in his idols. When it comes to prosperity, Baal is quite at home in the world today. Do you stand with Elijah or Baal? Take a very close look and see who you expect to bring the rain. So that's the end of the quote from Dr. Moen, and that's a good note to leave this lesson on, but I felt it kind of incomplete. So I wanted to ask this by way of a series of questions. What is the rain that you're looking for? What is it that you need that's trying to be met by the Baals of the world? Does Eliyahu call to you like he calls to me? How long will you waver between 2 opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. And remember, it says the people said nothing. They said nothing because they weren't sure who actually held all the power. They legitimately didn't know. So they said nothing. So what's the big thing in your life that you're wavering about? Wavering on really who has the answer, who really is sovereign. Is it God? Is it something else? Is it someone else? And if you don't honestly know, are you also saying nothing in that situation? Now, saying nothing, that can look like paralysis, like doing nothing about whatever that situation is. Saying nothing can look like you aren't really addressing the issue. Maybe you're pretending it doesn't exist or it's not that big of a deal. Or it can look like you're hedging your bets. The answer is God, but also something else. So I wonder, inspired by this Haftarah, are you ready to put God to the test? Now, I don't mean put him to the test, but are you ready to put your faith in him to the test? So what's that big obstacle in your life? The famine, the drought. What does that represent? Is it an unbelieving spouse that you don't really know if God actually will or can resurrect them from spiritual death? So when you pray about it, you only give half-hearted prayers? Is it the famine or the drought in your life? Is it a character issue that's in your life? Something that you just don't quite think that God can rescue you from? So maybe you're trying in your own willpower? Is your famine or your drought related to your role as a matriarch of your family, or your role as daughter of the Most High, whose task it is to build the kingdom of God? How long will you waver between two opinions? Asks Elijah. Well, I know that I waver very much between believing that God's got this in my situations and me thinking that I'm never going to be a good enough image bearer for the kingdom to actually partner with God to make changes. So what's it going to take for us to, so to speak, set up those altars, wet them down real good with buckets of water, pray, and then stand back and watch God work his wonders? I wonder if we're ready to put it all out on the line like Eliyahu did. And I do honestly believe that God is big enough to come through for you and for me in whatever drought that we're in. And I do think that now is the time for us to set that stage for the miraculous of God. You know, as you ponder the Haftarah this week, maybe this is the week for you to experience the miracles in your drought. I'll see you next week in the next Haftarah.